Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our webinar this morning on cowpea production or black-eyed pea production. I want to start off by thanking the Colorado Department of Agriculture, the research that was done through a specialty crop block grant program at the Colorado Department of Ag and the USDA. Some research that Joel Schneekloth and I did for cowpeas was funded through that program, and then a part of that research and funding was to do this webinar so that we could share our results from our trials in the last year. So we're very appreciative of funding from them. Also, CSU Extension has kindly supported this webinar, and then also we are thankful to Trinidad Benham and Farmer Bean and Seed for their support and participation in our webinar this morning. So with that, I'm going to give you all an introduction to cowpeas, black-eyed peas, give you a basic overview, talk about trial results from the trial that I did on them last year, and then we'll have Don Pope speak from Farmer Bean and Seed. He's an agronomist with them. Courtney Schuler from Trinidad Benham will talk. And then Joel Schneekloth will wrap up and talk about water use and irrigated trials that he did. Okay, so just a short introduction for myself. I'm Sally Jones Diamond. I'm the Crops Testing Program Director at Colorado State University. I'm also the CSU Extension Crop Production Specialist for the state. And my team and I are based out in eastern Colorado at Akron. So what's in a name? So we've heard black-eyed peas, cowpea. What should we be calling these legumes? Black-eyed peas are a subspecies of cowpea. So you can see in the picture there, cowpea includes all different sorts of colors and patterns on the actual seeds. So all black-eyed peas are cowpeas. Not all cowpeas are black-eyed peas. Black-eyed peas may also be called southern field peas, crowder peas, or just field peas. And then today, for this webinar, we are specifically focusing on black-eyed peas. So what is a black-eyed pea? You can see their picture. You've probably seen those in the grocery store in bags. You might eat them during New Year's for celebrations. Black-eyed peas are part of the Vigna unguiculata genus and species. So that's a different genus and species than common beans and different from peas. So the Vigna genus is very large. It has over 200 species in that genus. And so that includes, in the Vigna genus, it includes mung beans, erd beans, azuki bean, bombura groundnuts, and then also black-eyed peas. So what do they look like? You can see the picture there. I figured the easiest comparison would probably be to pinto beans. So I've got a picture of pinto beans on the left, right at flowering or pod fill, and then on the right is a picture of black-eyed peas, also during pod fill. So pintos set their pods somewhat high in the canopy, but usually it's also within the plant canopy. And then pinto beans also tend to vine out. They're a bushy plant. So even if you plant them on 30-inch rows on irrigated, oftentimes you'll get nice coverage over the rows and you'll get a little bit of vining. And so they tend to be lower to the ground, generally speaking. There are some more upright varieties. So cowpeas or black-eyed peas, when you look at them, even just driving by a field, they stick out like a sore thumb because black-eyed peas have the seeds. The seed pods are usually above the plant canopy. They're higher up in the plant, and they splay out on the top there, which you can kind of see. So they look quite a bit different in the field. And there's another close-up picture of black-eyed peas. So what is a black-eyed pea? It's widely produced in warm and temperate regions of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. It's used primarily for human consumption. All parts of the plant are usable, not just the seeds. You can eat the leaves. It's a very highly nutritious plant, not only for humans, but also for animal feed. And so part of the beauty of the crop is that it can be used for human consumption, or you can use it for fodder. So for this webinar and the research that Joel and I are doing, we're focusing on black-eyed peas for grain production in our area. There are some CSU researchers that are looking at cowpeas or black-eyed peas for forage production. One of those researchers is Dr. J.B. Ma, and he works out of the Rocky Ford Experiment Station down in the Arkansas Valley. So he would be a person to contact if you have a question about forages or using it for forage. Also, Dr. Jessica Davis, who is based on campus in Fort Collins. She is our pulse crop agronomist, and she is another great resource for information on that. So the growing environment, cowpeas or black-eyed peas are well suited for semi-arid regions under dryland or limited irrigation production. Joel will talk more about that in a minute, about they don't like to have a bunch of irrigation, so they're very well suited for limited irrigation production if you have water available. They're usually planted in early June, harvested in mid to late September. They're adapted to high temperatures in the summer and to drought. They're short season, and they're a legume, so that means that they will fix nitrogen in the soil, which is excellent. So the production potential in Colorado, there are few acres currently produced in Colorado. It's just a small portion of overall dry bean acres. It's lumped in with dry beans when you look at USDA NASS reports. So it's a very small percentage of acres right now. The market for the grain, however, is available already. There is a market, and Dawn and Courtney will talk about that when they give their presentations. We already mentioned it's a dual purpose crop if needed. So if you have a crop failure and it's not worth harvesting for the grain seed, then it could be grazed by livestock and be really good fodder. It's a low input crop in terms of fertility needs, and it fits very well into existing rotations that we already have with winter wheat or prozone millet or corn or grain sorghum. So it fits well into there. Those are all grasses, and so it would be nice to get a broadleaf legume plant into that rotation. So the research needs, as I see it, from my perspective, is that currently in the United States, there are only 2 varieties that are really being planted for production by farmers. Those varieties are CB5 and CB46. They were bred by a public cowpea program at the University of California, Riverside. I'm not sure which one is, I think CB46 is the newer variety, but they've both been around for over 10 years. And so there's not a flush of new varieties every year like you might see in other crops. So to me, we need new variety options that are higher in grain yield, adapted to our growing conditions. And what I would like to do is do seed increases of those promising cultivars and get them to farmers. So I'm going to focus in on the yield trial that I did last year. Akron, this was in collaboration with Maria Munoz Amatrine. She was a cowpea breeder here at CSU for a couple years, and she really got my team and Joel really excited about cowpeas. I had never seen the crop before, and after we saw it grow at Akron there for a couple dry years, it's just we got really excited about it because it's very highly adapted. So she was definitely the spark that got that going. She's now moved on to a different university in Spain, So she's no longer at CSU, but we still do work with her. And again, my yield trials were sponsored and funded through a grant with Colorado Department of Agriculture. So in this yield trial, I was testing commercially released varieties alongside land races from a gene bank. Some accessions show promise for adaptability to Colorado because they have early maturity, they're upright plants, which would allow for direct harvesting, high yielding. And so I'm working on the next steps to make those new varieties available for growers because some of them, depending on where they originate from, you can do seed increases. Anybody could do a seed increase on them and sell it for seed, and they're not patented varieties. They're free for anybody to use. So here on the left, you can see a table of the results from the dryland variety trial at Akron in 2022. So on the far left, there's the variety name or accession number, which probably doesn't mean a lot. There's not a lot of named varieties. What I think is really interesting is if you look at the next column of the origin of the varieties, you can see that they come from all over the world. The top yielding ones were from Botswana, Australia, bred in California through that public breeding program. There's some from Puerto Rico, Italy, Portugal. You can read on down the list there. So they come from a wide variety of places across the world. CB5, again, is a common variety grown in Colorado, along with CB46. And then I also wanted to point out the yield range was 800 pounds an acre down to a little under 300 pounds an acre. And so those yields were obtained on less than 6 inches of rain that we had in Akron in 2022. So those aren't anything to scoff at. And then finally, I just want to put in a plug for our website. If you go to csucrops.com, we have a different page for all the different crops that we work on. So if you click on dry beans and cowpea, that'll bring up the table that I just showed you. That's on there from the variety trial last year. And we also have some educational videos that Joel and Don and I recorded during the summer, during the growing season on black-eyed peas. And so those are on the page there that you can view. And with that, there's my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And I think we'll go ahead and move to the next speaker then and wait for questions until after Courtney and Dawn talk about some of the agronomics and the marketing. Thank you.
I'm Courtney Schuler, and I'm the Field Operations Manager for Trinidad Benham. Trinidad Benham is a dry bean processor in the region, and we were founded back in 1917 in Trinidad, Colorado. Today, I will go through several different brief topics based on black-eyed peas and cowpeas in general. And I hope that, like she said, if you have any questions, post those in the chat, and we'll follow through with those as the presentation comes to an end. Let's see if I can get this to advance. All right, so like I said, Trinidad started over 100 years ago down in Trinidad, Colorado, and we are the largest dry packager of beans, rice, and popcorn in the United States. We also have a foil division, and for those of you, I know we have probably a different mix of producers on the webinar this morning. So those of you who aren't familiar with dry bean processors, we do provide support to our producers throughout the season. So we supply seed and support with selection of seed, agronomic support throughout the year, and different marketing options for whatever beans you end up producing. This is a snapshot of where our different locations are throughout the country. We have origination in the Colorado, Nebraska area, and the locations there to the right show where we are receiving in this area. Sterling is one of our locations. We receive pintos and black eyes there. Imperial is another one where we receive light red kidneys, pintos, Mayacobas, and black eyes. And Bridgeport would be the other main one where we receive pintos, slow darkening pintos, Great Northerns, and black eyes. Other receiving locations in Western Nebraska include Alliance, Baird, and Gearing. And then you can see we have some seed locations up in Idaho and Western Wyoming, and then other packaging and different plants located throughout the country. So now I'll move into just basically a brief market summary that will tell you why black eyes are important, and both on domestic and the international scene. And I looked up the world production of cowpeas, and this, Sally touched on the difference between cowpeas and black eyes. And I also, pulled a photo of cowpeas and their diversity there up at the top of the screen. But the world production is estimated, if my conversion from metric tons to bushels is correct, at about 230 million bushels annually. And over 85% of that production is in Africa. And they basically produce what they can, or they consume what they produce. It's an ideal crop for developing countries because, again, as Sally mentioned, you can consume both the grain and the forage. It's a legume, so it's going to build up the soil with nutrients. It helps to limit erosion. And they also use it as a double cropping system with millet and other small grains. So, it's excellent in a lot of those situations in many parts of the world. And as, export and import markets below, in recent years, the top export markets were Brazil, Madagascar, and Peru, and the top import markets were India, Turkey, and the United States. Sometimes these statistics can be a little bit skewed because some of these countries will either be pulling that crop from another country and then basically being used as a pass-through both directions. So sometimes that's not necessarily where that product is being produced or where it's being consumed, but that's what the data is showing right now. Domestically, the US production is mainly in California and Texas, and it's less than 1 million bushels of production a year. So basically less than 1% of the world production is in the United States. And there's been pressure on that production due to drought and a number of things in recent years. And domestic consumption is really concentrated over the New Year's holiday for good luck. You can see a lot of the East Coast and the southern parts of the US will purchase and make this dish that I put a picture of up here. I'll make it with collard greens. It's usually called Hop and John, and I'll eat black-eyed peas for the New Year's holiday. But there are a lot of dry packaged, canned, and IQF products available when it comes to black-eyed peas. IQF stands for individually quick frozen. So sometimes you'll see black-eyed peas that are frozen and mixed in with some of the frozen vegetable mixes that you'll find in the grocery store. All right, moving on to some of the production and agronomics. All right, so days to maturity is close to about 90 to 95. Growth habit is upright. Seed size, depending on the variety used, is about 1,700 to 2,200 seeds per pound. And late May to early June is our typical window for planting. And there's some debate on inoculation, whether it's useful or not, just like with any dry bean. But I just wanted to make a note in here that it is a different rhizobium to use than with any of the other crops that we have in the area, because it is a Vigna species. So it's a different bacteria than with dry bean or soybean or field pea or chickpea or any of those. It's very important to note that it is called cowpea, southern pea, or black-eyed pea, and you might see any of those things when you're looking through literature or looking through chemical labels and so forth. So it's really important to know and keep that in mind. It is a hardy, drought-tolerant, warm season legume. We've touched on that already. And it's tricky because it is considered a dry bean when it comes to marketing, but it's completely different species and when you're talking about everything else and producing it. So you want to investigate your herbicide history on whatever fields you are thinking of producing it on, because it's tolerant to different chemical history than typical dry beans. And really thoroughly read all of your labels on all products before applying. Because it is going to be, it's going to say cowpea, not necessarily dry bean. And the way you handle your inputs and management is going to be a lot different than a dry bean. So Dawn's going to touch on some of that in a lot more detail than I am. But that's just a really important thing to think about for yourself. And if you have any, agronomists or people that help you manage your fields throughout the year, that's something they're thinking about. And dry beans are a specialty crop, so they can't be treated like grain crops are. If you're not familiar with that, you really have to be careful at harvest to limit the damage to that crop, to minimize your dockage when you bring it into the elevator. A lot of producers will put slow down kits and do a lot of different modifications to their machines to make sure they're not splitting and cracking and damaging beans at harvest. And then another thing that's very critical is to really be careful to eliminate the risk of contamination from other crops. That can include your typical crops that may be volunteer out in the field, or it may even come from a cover crop species that you planted out there previously, that there were some volunteers that came back from that. So anything that's going to be left in that product that the processor is going to have to clean out, that could potentially throw a red flag to our end users is something to think about. And obviously those of us that are working with you when it comes to the company you're working with can help identify that and help with that. Touch quickly on diseases. You can see some disease in these when it comes to obviously the hail we sometimes see in the year, or sometimes, especially last year when we had a lot of high wind events and wind damage to the leaves. You can see some bacterial infection similar to what you see on dry bean species. And the photos here of the leaves, you can see the lesions and damage, and it will even move through onto the pods and into the beans. You can see some of the beans in that photo have some brownish coloring to them. So we've seen this some in Nebraska, and just something you want to be, pay attention to and stay on top of if you do see it in your fields. And there has been some fungal disease found too. Obviously that hasn't been as prolific in recent years with the heat and drought that we've had. So, but something to keep in mind if we do see a change in our weather patterns. And these are just some photos showing some of the growth and development. You can see that center photo shows basically how the blooms progress around the flower shoot. Basically each day another one of those blooms will open and then the pod will start developing. And then the photo down towards the bottom right, you can see the multiple flowers and pods developing there. So that's like Sally mentioned, a lot of those pods are towards the top of the plant, and which makes it really nice for keeping the pods up off the ground for direct harvest options and other situations. And this shows basically how those seeds develop within the pod. They're obviously much different with how many seeds you get per pod. I think on that, let's see, I think there's about 11 seeds per pod on that photo to the right. And basically they'll, form as a green seed in the pod, then they'll start to get their black eye, which is, purple to begin with, and then it turns black, and then that greenish part of the seed will begin to turn white, and that's the point that they are physiologically mature. And this is just finally a picture of what they look like when they're ripening and maturing, getting ready for harvest. So just some real basic information here. Our seed cost this year is around $68 a unit, and that's going to be for 100,000 seeds. 100,000 seeds are a unit. So your cost per acre is going to differ on whether you're planting dry land or irrigated, and it can even vary what area you're in based upon what your yield potential is on dry land and so forth, and your row spacing. And I know Dawn's going to go into a little more detail on that. We didn't want to get too repetitive when it came to both of our presentations. So some of the questions you have from my presentation may get covered and probably will get covered in his. We do currently have contracts available. Those contracts do have an act of God clause, and they are full production pricing. And I'll have my contact information up here in a minute. So if you're interested, you can reach out following today's presentation, and we can talk through that. Another question that's obviously very, very important is crop insurance. And depending on your location, a written agreement should or may be available. We've had a lot of producers that have had success getting those in Nebraska, and I believe the same thing has happened in Colorado. It just depends on your county and your location, and we can work through that too. So, but there's other products that are available too, like hail insurance, and I'll skip back up to that second bullet. And again, it's tricky because they're called a black-eyed pea, but they are a dry bean and crop insurance. So they're a dry bean, and the type is black eye. So when your insurance agent is trying to find them under pea, they're not going to find them. They're under dry bean with the black eye type. But we've had like Sally's yield trials. We've had some trials up in Nebraska. So there's data out there to support insurance. Now, is it going to be a real high guaranteed yield? No, but the product should be available for you if you go through the steps to get that written agreement submitted. Let's see. As far as other inputs, I know Sally mentioned that they are, a really low input crop that works well in our rotations, and that's really the key. Is that we've had a lot of challenges lately with irrigation water, and I'm sure everyone on the call is in that situation, and so these give you a chance to have a profitable crop on that ground where you can save some of your water allocation. And it also gives you a chance to have something on that ground that you can go in and get a cover crop or forage or something established behind. So that's another great option. Once again, we've got to really look closely at your rotational restrictions when it comes to herbicides. But once that's established, it should be a great option for anyone who needs something like that this year and moving forward. As I mentioned, the U.S. is one of the top import markets for black-eyed peas, and maybe with a little bit more work in this region, we can help eliminate that and grow them here in the U.S. With that, I think that's my last slide. So thank you for the opportunity today. Thank you, Sally and Joel, for putting this together. I'd be happy to answer any questions now, or if they are kind of production related, maybe we should push those to the end of Dawn's.
Yeah, I think we might wait until after Dawn's, Courtney. And I know some of these questions asked in the chat are being answered, but we're still going to read them out loud, just in case others on here have something to add for those that are listening on the phone. So yeah, thank you, Courtney.
Perfect.
All right, and Dawn Pope is going to speak next from Farmer Bean and Seed. And Dawn, you should be able to share your screen.
You see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Sally. I'm Don Pope. I'm the field agronomist with Farmer Bean and Seed in Yuma, Colorado. And Farmer Bean and Seed, we accept black-eyed peas, pintos, light red kidneys, black beans, small reds, yellows, great northerns, basically any kind of dry bean that we can produce in the area, with the exception of the garbanzo bean. We do not deal with that one, but basically everything else we take in there to Yuma. And currently we're a one location bean company. As far as Colorado goes, we have another location in Quincy, Washington, and we have plans to expand and add some more receiving stations in the area. Sally asked me to discuss the marketing, agronomy, and the profitability of black-eyed peas. I'll kind of buzz quickly through some of the marketing stuff, as Courtney did a good job of covering the marketing for the black-eyed peas. And my contact information's there. If anybody has questions, you want to reach out to me at a later date, you can call me or email me anytime. So the current market for black-eyed peas, there is a good domestic and international market. Some of the other leading exporters would be Europe, United States, and Canada. And like Courtney said, California and Texas produce the majority by far of the United States production. And there is a good market for both the conventional and the organic markets, and we accept both of those classes of beans. We have some organic producers that have done well with the black-eyed peas as well as the conventional. And I'll just buzz through this quickly. This will just be a nice visual map here of where black-eyed peas are produced around the world. So like Courtney said, Africa produces by far the most. Brazil would be the second highest producing country, but Africa has a lot of countries that produce black-eyed peas. So they're by far producing the most. The United States is currently a small producer of black-eyed peas. And we import black-eyed peas in the United States, so we do not currently produce enough to fulfill our demand. And of course, we export some black-eyed peas as well, because that's just how things work. We export things even though we don't have enough here, and bring stuff in from other countries. All right, so on the agronomy and cropping systems, the black-eyed pea is a very drought-tolerant crop. I would argue as drought-tolerant as any dry land limited irrigation crop that we have. Would compare it to grain sorghum or millet as far as its drought tolerance, but there's a much higher profitability potential with the black-eyed peas. When things go well, there's much more upside to those. They can handle a wide range of soil types. This slide says 4.3 to 7.9 pH. We have had black-eyed peas on 8.2 pHs, and they handle that just fine. I would say that on those higher 8.2, 8.3 pHs that they probably don't handle it quite as well as like a pinto bean, but they still grow and produce seed. But you will, have some reduced yield as you get into those 8 pHs. As far as the fertility goes, they take very little fertility. On the dryland acre, we have not applied any nitrogen. We've just went with whatever the residual nitrogen was in the soil, which is typically 40 to 60 pounds of residual nitrogen in our medium textured soils. But I would just maintain a healthy balance of your NP and K, and you'll do just fine. As far as the irrigated acre, we will put on, ideally we want to soil test and see what our residual nitrogen is, and we might add another 30 or 40 pounds of nitrogen to get up to an 80-pound total for the crop. We want to be careful about putting on excess nitrogen because this will basically just produce undesirable biomass when we're talking about seed production, where harvest becomes more difficult because we have too much plant matter, and it does not increase your seed yield by having that additional plant matter. And like Courtney mentioned, basically my stance on the inoculant is there could be a value there, especially when we look at the potential residual nitrogen left over from the crop. But I would say 90% of our black-eyed peas that we've grown, we have not put any inoculant on them. And we've gotten along just fine, but I know Joel and Sally and myself and Courtney are all interested in some further research on the inoculant side to see what that can do for us. So on the weed management, it's definitely different than other dry beans. The big watchouts are definitely do not use Outlook, Eptam, or Reflex, which are very common herbicides on other dry beans, but this will cause too much crop damage to the black-eyed peas to tolerate. We've gotten along very well with, especially on the dryland acre, if we can start clean using glyphosate or gramoxone or tillage to start clean, and then just using a pre-emerge. We put it on right after planting, Authority Elite, which is the same thing as Spartan and Dual combined. Some folks still have some Spartan sitting around their chemical sheds, and that works very well. There is a watch out using Authority on light textured sandy soils. So consult with your chemical rep. There's some other options like Prowl and Pursuit that you can use on sandier soils, but consult with your agronomist and your chemical reps to see where their comfort level is based on your soil texture. As far as a post-emerge, like a third trifoliate type of an application, we're fairly limited to products like Permit, Raptor, Basagran, but I do believe using Permit as a post application has worked pretty well as far as buying us another 2 or 3 weeks worth of time to keep our Palmer amaranth out in puncture vine. So that's our best option there. The other options would basically be, running a cultivator through there. This picture here is an organic producer of ours who is using an electric wick. So it's actually electrocuting the weeds that are above the canopy. And we have other customers that use herbicide wicks that go over the top of the canopy and just apply herbicide directly onto the weeds. That works fairly well as far as managing those weeds. We're mainly concerned with the harvestability of the crop when it comes to these weeds. Hand labor is another one. If there's hand labor available in your area, it is definitely worth spending the extra. We have guys that'll spend over $100 an acre on hand labor, but when it comes to harvest, it definitely pays off to have those fields cleaner, because when you have weeds, you have to put so much pressure on the crop with the combine to be able to get through the weeds that you end up damaging, I would say, close to 5 to 10% of the crop, just depending on the weed pressure. And so that's basically your loss is 5 to 10% of crushed beans. You end up with a lot of foreign matter in your crop. So planting and harvest on the dry land and the heavy textured soils, I prefer having narrow rows, and it doesn't really matter if it's 7.5s or 10s or 15s, but I prefer the narrow rows to get us a little bit quicker canopy. We plant everything between 75 and 100,000 seeds per acre, and that's both on dry land and irrigated. We typically are closer to the 75,000 on dry land and closer to the 100 on irrigated. But I have seen dry land fields being planted at 100,000, and it is nice as far as a plant canopy side of things go, to have more population just for weed management purposes. On the lighter textured soils on your irrigated ground, I would prefer the crop be planted on 30-inch centers, just to allow a cultivator to be able to get through there. If a cultivator is not an option for you, then it doesn't really matter. But that's where we've struggled more with weed control, is on the sandy ground under irrigation. And so I think that there would be a value there to be able to get a cultivator through there. As far as a final stand, I prefer 50,000 plants per acre or more for a final stand. Certainly if you had 40,000 plants, that would still be tolerable, and not something to replant or tear out, but I prefer over 50,000 plants per acre. As far as harvest goes, growers can direct harvest this crop with, you usually have to use a desiccate of like a gramoxone to be able to get the crop dry enough, because the plants will stay green a long time, and it might even look like it's drying down pretty well. But then if we get some later moisture in the fall, things will green up and it'll actually start regrowing and trying to put on more pods, which just doesn't work to try to wait for that. So we basically wait until the first pods are set, the crop looks like it's starting to dry down, and then we when our pods are about 80 to 90% tan colored, we'll desiccate the crop and you can direct harvest it. It also works to do it in more of a traditional bean harvest, which would be swathing or pulling the plants and picking them up with a combine. But as far as if you're not a bean producer, you know, basically the equipment that you would need is just a grain drill or a planter and a combine, and you can raise black-eyed peas without a problem. So as long as we keep the weeds under control, we'll be in good shape. So rainfall irrigation requirements. On the medium textured soils, if we start with a full profile, if we get somewhere around 4 inches of rainfall between mid-June and early August, basically we're going to be able to achieve a profitable crop when we have a crop value of $40 per hundredweight, which the black-eyed pea market is better than $40 right now, or around that mark. On the lighter textured soils, your sands, you're probably going to need more like 6 to 8 inches of rainfall through that same time period to reach that profitability mark. And then when we have the ability to irrigate the crop, if we can put on 14 inches, basically take whatever your rainfall is, and you want your total water to come out to about 14 inches rain plus irrigation. So not, you know, just 14 inches of irrigation. It's you need to take your rainfall into consideration, and if you can add more to substitute for lack of rain, then that's our target to reach basically the yield potential of this crop. What we've seen so far is about 2,500 to 2,800 pounds per acre is kind of our maximum yield potential, which is a very profitable crop at that rate. As far as the sandy ground, you know, we got to kind of factor in another probably 2 to 4 inches of rainfall irrigation to reach our full yield potential under the sandy, with the sandy conditions. And again, same thing with the nitrogen. We don't want to overdo it on the irrigation because we'll end up with undesirable biomass that will just be a pain when it comes to harvest time. And so we want to manage our rainfall, our irrigation, and our nitrogen to minimize that potential. So to reach profitability on the crop, Courtney touched on the seed cost per acre, and you know, you're going to have some chemical costs, and that's basically it, besides, you know, the planting and the harvest costs. So we're looking at somewhere around 350 to 400 pounds per acre is where we're going to cross the profitability line. Just to kind of give you an idea, the last 2 years, which is the extent of farmer beans taking this crop into Yuma, in 2021, our dryland yields ranged from 500 to 1,000 pounds per acre. The best yields were on wheat stubble. Lower yields for that year anyway were on corn ground. And then in 2022, we had 200 to 700 pounds of yield, just based on where you were at. I think most of us in that area would argue that 2022 was probably the worst drought year that we've ever had. And so we did have some acres that were not profitable, but we still had acres that were profitable in probably the worst year we've ever had. So I feel very comfortable that we can, you know, be profitable, you know, 8, 9 years out of 10 very easily. And then on the irrigation side, we've been very consistent. If we can get the prescribed water on, like I discussed earlier, and keep the weeds under control, we've consistently raised 22 to 2,800 pounds an acre on the limited irrigation. And that's where we target the irrigated acres at is either a situation where you just don't have enough water to apply, or like when we get into Nebraska, they have watering restrictions, and so they can bank water on one field and use it on another field. And so that's the ideal fit. It wouldn't be something to put on a fully irrigated situation where you have the ability to raise a full production crop of, say, a pinto bean or a black bean. That would be a better option for you. But if you're limited, then that's where the black-eyed pea comes into play. And then in case of a crop failure, the black-eyed peas do have a very high animal feed nutrition value, very similar to alfalfa. I'm not a animal nutritionist, so I'm not going to get into too deep into the weeds there, but there is a very high feed value to the black-eyed peas if you bale it or chop it. And with that, there's contact information again, and Ryan Erickson is really does most of the marketing for Farmer Bean and Seed, so his contact information is here as well if you have more questions around the value of the crop and understanding the marketing side of the black-eyed peas.
Thank you, Don. Since we're doing good on time, Joel, do you mind if we answer some of these agronomic questions that would apply more to Don and Courtney and I before we get into
go ahead.
Okay. See, we had a question about determinate and indeterminate varieties. Grace, to my knowledge, there's not indeterminate varieties, or not at least commercially grown, but Don or Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong on that, or somebody else in the chat.
I would say that most of the varieties are indeterminate in that they will continue to put on more seed if we don't run into a frost situation. That's why we desiccate the crop or have to swath it, because it will continue to put on more pods and seeds. But I don't know about all the other varieties, but the one that we use, I would call an indeterminate.
Okay. What would happen if they were planted earlier? Is row spacing and singulation critical?
Yes, I think Jason Webb did a good job of answering. Row spacing is not that critical, other than, like I said, I like them on 30 inches on sand so we can get a cultivator through there. Prefer them on narrower rows for quicker canopy. But as far as the singulation goes, we get along just fine with a grain drill. You're always gonna have a more uniform emergence when you use a planter, but it's not something to be too concerned about. As far as the planting date goes, we want to avoid frost when we can, so we're looking at towards the end of May, first part of June. I do think we could potentially plant them later, and that might help out. Is later meaning June 15th, to manage that early weed flush. I think that there could be some value there, but it just kind of depends on the situation.
If we planted later, would it be possible then to, in some years, avoid a desiccant because it would just freeze?
Yeah, if we happen to get an early frost in September, then you could avoid a desiccant if it was a killing frost.
Okay.
I have though seen them freeze too soon, and since the pods are above the plant, you don't get the protection of the foliage, and so you see bean damage a lot more easily with these than other dry beans. And I have seen people try to push the planting date sooner and if ground temperatures aren't up where you need them to be, you can just see a lot of stress on the seedlings, including a lot of root issues. So obviously there's some, there's some leeway, but they are warm season legumes, so we do need a little bit of ground temperature there.
Yeah, and they are a kind of a slow crop to take off, especially if you have colder conditions. So it's something that even if you plant them 1st of June, you're going to start wondering, first part of July, is this crop ever going to take off? Because they're kind of slow to get going, and then the second half of the season, then they really take off. But I think going much earlier is just gonna put that much more stress, like Courtney said, on the early seedlings.
Is there any info on whether nitrogen fixing capacity is different than other legumes? If it's a different inoculum, would the fixation rates differ? That's a great question, Grace.
So there is a unique inoculum. I think there's a couple different ones that you can use. I would say that the fixation is going to be very similar to other dry beans, which is what we typically see is about a maybe 30-40 pound increase on the next year. It's a little difficult to measure that because it's a slow release. But that's typically what we see with soil tests, whether it be black-eyed peas or other edible beans, that field will test somewhere around 40 pounds higher than if it were, a corn field the year before.
The literature I've seen has shown that they'll fix more than 100 pounds an acre, but obviously they're using a lot of that. So just depends on what you're harvesting and taking off and the amount of residue you're leaving.
Right. There's a question about, and I think this was during your talk, Courtney, how much space should be planned per unit of seed? So I think Joel answered that as a seeding rate question, which we discussed.
Yeah, I think Don touched on that. He mentioned, closer to 75,000 on dry land and closer to 100,000 on irrigated. And I think that's very, that's pretty much right on. If there's areas that the dry land, we have some areas, further west that may not have quite the dry land potential that other areas do. And so, we may go down a little bit lower than that, but it's pretty close.
Okay. Let's see. Sam Peck had a comment. Don, I think this was during yours with the world map. Brazil's mostly brown eye production, not black eyed peas. He thought they went to India.
Mm-hmm.
And then
yeah, that could very well be it. That probably fell under the cowpea.
Right. Also, Don, during yours, the phosphorus recommendation, I think it said like 25 to 50 parts per million. And Jessica was wondering if that was what extraction method that was, because that seems high for like the Olson extraction. Like, is there phosphorus needs? Is the need really high? Is it a high use crop for that, or is it?
No, it's not. It's just basically manage your phosphorus levels.
Okay.
Like you would. I mean, phosphorus is a long-term management process. So as long as you're managing your phosphorus levels for other crops, you're gonna do just fine. And something else that I forgot to mention is we get a lot of questions about the leftover residue and how well the residue holds the ground over the winter. And it does have, you can leave a good 4 to 6 inches worth of stalks on these black-eyed peas because all the pods are on top of the plant. And so we have a lot of residue there. And one of our producers said last year during the winter of 21-22, where we had a lot of wind, a lot of ground blowing in eastern Colorado, that the black-eyed peas held the ground better than the millet stubble did, which is pretty impressive because the millet stubble does a good job of holding the ground. So that just gives guys an idea what that residue is going to look like over the winter.
Grace, you asked a question about yield production potential. Don touched on that, and then Joel will talk about that too. He did some irrigated studies. But if you have a question still after Joel's, go ahead and ask. And then somebody asked, how are FSA fruit and vegetable rules handled?
I assume they're asking maybe around the crop insurance piece, which Courtney talked about, but I'm not sure.
We might have to handle that off the webinar, because I'm not sure exactly what rules those are. And
okay. Okay. All right. I think that covers everything so far. So Joel's going to talk to us about his irrigation water use studies.
Okay, make sure I'm on the right one here. Can everybody see that now? Oops, nope, I haven't shared. There now.
Yeah.
Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. So this will kind of get back into some of the questions about max production and those other ones. I'm going to minimize that. So, I was involved with Sally as well as Maria early on, and I was kind of like, when they brought that out, the cowpeas, I was going like, yeah, right. Drought tolerant is probably like typical dry beans. Well, it isn't. It's much different than that, and that's what brought me onto those. So, the reason I did looking at this is it showed, extreme drought resilience in 2020. That was a year when our dryland summer crops failed. Millet was horrible, was not that great. Corn was not that great. So we did talk with, I'll give him a shout out, Jason Webb, who was with Trinidad Benham at the time. And we talked about the irrigation potential of these and that. And one of the comments he kept saying was, I think our producers are overwatering and costing them some yield or water. So we decided to look at this, and my career, I've been looking at crop alternatives because I'm an irrigation scientist, and in the Ogallala we're a declining resource, and trying to find lower water use, high value crops that we can utilize and hopefully cut consumptive use of the aquifer over time and extend the lifespan of that as well. So here you can see some of the things I've worked on over time over there. Now, what was interesting to me is, dry beans, dry edibles have had a long history in Colorado, but they've been declining over the years. And I think everybody can agree with that. Corn production has become too easy. And some of the things with dry bean production over time was the undercutting, conservation methods on highly erodible land really wasn't what people wanted to see. Economics were there. I know producers that got out of dry bean production because they said the economics of your pintos and that was too variable year to year, and they wanted something they could consistently try to grow year in, year out and maintain the production and the economics of that as well. So in 2019, according to the handbook, FSA handbook, 37,000 acres in all of Colorado. And back in 1980, it was 250,000, or 1990, it was 250,000 acres. So we've had a substantial decline in that. So the questions we're looking at with this study is the yield response of black-eyed peas, developing a yield-ET relationship and some maximum yield potentials as well. Water timing under irrigation, is it better in the vegetative, which typically is not, but more towards reproductive, and how much water during that reproductive time period is necessary. So we're also looking at water use efficiency. That goes back to the yield ET, also yield biomass as well. And a couple simple things on economics we'll see as we go from there, as well as water conservation. So this was conducted under a rainout shelter. So all water was delivered through those tubes you see on the ground. And the reason for that is if you're really trying to develop a quick yield ET relationship, Mother Nature can cause you havoc with one good big rainstorm at the wrong time, or hailstorms and that. So we wanted to make sure we had those. So these plots have been historically utilized to develop these type of functions. Right here in the middle, you see a neutron probe. That was our water monitoring system, and all the yields were pretty much coming out of the middle of this plot where we were monitoring soil moisture. So the 4 treatments we had was average rainfall. I would love it if we'd got a ½ inch every week of the year during the summer, but that's our typical average, long-term average, or well, actually short-term. We kind of looked at the long-term. It was a little bit more. The shorter term over the last 10 years, we've been a little bit drier during the summer, so we went with that. A 4-inch allocation, so it got the ½ inch of rainfall every week plus 2 inches of irrigation starting at that beginning of the reproductive stage. And the beginning of the reproductive is when you start to see the elongation of that flower stem, which they call the peduncle. There is also an 8-inch allocation. So again, a ½ inch a week for the rainfall and 2 inches every week for 4 weeks at the beginning of the reproductive. And then we also have full irrigation where we're trying to do BMP management, maintain soil moisture in the active root zone between 50 and 80% of plant available, so it's not under stress, plus the ½ inch every week. Grain yield, 2021, we see dryland yields of about 1,000 pounds. With the 4 inches of irrigation, we were about 1,600 pounds, and fully irrigated and the 8-inch maxed out yields that year at about 2,550 to 2,600 pounds. 22 dry land was actually higher. We were up to 1,300 pounds per acre. The 4-inch allocation came in about 2,000. The full and the 8-inch were a little bit lower than in 21, but we're still 2,200 to 2,300 pounds. So the 2-year average, we can see the potential under average conditions on dry land, about 1,200 pounds. Dry land, somewhere around that 1,750 to 1,800 pounds with 4 inches of irrigation applied at the right time. And with 8 inches of irrigation applied at the right time, close to that 2,500 pound range. Full irrigation did not increase yield, as you can see here. So yield ET relationship. So that's our development that we looked at. So we're looking at multiple plots and that, looking at the actual crop water use through there. So with the rain fed under average conditions, we're sitting here about 8 inches of ET during the growing season on average. You can see that we have a nice good relationship here going up to about 15 inches of ET during the season. For every inch of water use, we get about 185 pounds of yield. Once we hit this about 2 inches of water use, which is our growth and maintenance type number that we typically figure during for the season. But what you see out here is this is the fully irrigated yields out here, and we really, on average, don't see much of an increase in yield. We actually see a flat line. I guess I didn't have that in there. A flat line. So from about 15 inches of ET on, yields really don't increase. We have higher yields, but we have lower yields. But on average, we really don't increase any much past that 2,500 pounds at Akron. So that's where we're looking at about 15 inches of ET on average is about what we want to see. Biomass. Now, biomass was much different than grain yield because once we past that 15 inches, we still had a very nice response of increasing biomass. So if you're looking at from a forage yield, you're wanting to increase ET. So you want to max out at about that 17.5 to 18 inches of ET if you're looking at it from a biomass standpoint. And total biomass, which includes the seed yield, at 18 inches is about 6,500 to 6,700 pounds dry matter. Now, this is a picture of the 4 different management strategies going clockwise from the upper left is dry land at near, we're getting close to harvest here. A 4-inch allocation of irrigation, so you can see a dramatic increase in upright and above ground biomass here. This is the 8-inch. You're still seeing a little bit in between the rows. These are 25-inch rows to fit within that rainout shelter. And this is full irrigation, which you see full cover at that point. Now what we're going to look at here is how does water impact the yield components? Seeds per pod, pods per plant, and seeds per pound, because those are the 3 major components that you're looking at. Seed size, we'll look at that first. Dry land, on average, 2,200 seeds per pound. When we go to the irrigated, we have adequate water. Let's look at full irrigation here on the far right. We're about 1,900 seeds per pound, same with that 8-inch allocation. So we're getting a bigger seed, it takes fewer seeds to produce a pound of yield. The 4-inch was really interesting. It wasn't quite statistically different, but it was close. We were down closer to about 1,700 seeds per pound. For some reason, we're developing a much bigger seed with a 4-inch allocation as compared to even having more water. Seeds per pod, this was an interesting one. It did not meet my expectations. I thought with more water, we would see more seeds per pod rather than that. Basically, dry land to full irrigation, same number of seeds per pod, roughly about 5.5 seeds per pod on average. Added water did not increase the number of seeds per pod. As we go into pods per plant versus crop water use, we have, again, a good relationship of increasing pods per plant as we increase ET. So this is one of the major components that we're seeing in the difference in yields. We retain and actually have more pods with the same number of seeds on average per plant as compared to irrigated or dry land. So that's where we're seeing most of our yield increase, as well as seeds per pound. So looking at this, I'm looking at this as the maximum ET compared to a pinto, which is a traditional dry bean crop for Northeast Colorado under irrigation. Maximum 17.5 to 18 inches for cowpeas, but our optima is in that 15 inches of ET. So that comes from stored soil moisture, irrigation, and rainfall. So as Don was saying, somewhere in that 14 inches of total precip and ET or irrigation is where you want to be at. But that's looking at pintos, which do produce a better yield, higher yields typically. You're closer to 20 inches of ET long-term in Northeast Colorado. So it's about a 2-inch savings with that. But as far as irrigation, all the previous research shows it's going to take more irrigation to meet the pinto needs because they are not as drought tolerant as the cowpeas. Economics, so we're going to look at a couple different components. One is the yield ET relationships of corn, wheat, proso, and cowpeas. 2 with it compared to each other. So we're going to look at the slope and the ET, which is how much yield it takes before we see that first pound of yield. So these are both critical needs or critical issues. Corn, and this is typically irrigated corn response because I like talking more about irrigation. We get about 15 to 16 bushels or about 900 pounds for every inch of ET once we pass that threshold, yield threshold. If we go back to dry land, we're probably more about 560 to 600 pounds per inch of ET just because of plant population densities and water stress. Wheat, which is our traditional dry land crop within the region, we get about 400 pounds per inch of ET, which is in that 7 to 7.5 bushels per inch of ET. Proso, which is again another good dry land crop, still again not as good of a response as wheat, about 250 pounds per inch of ET. Cowpeas is even slightly lower than that within the system. But if we look at how much water, and this is the dots here, how much water does it take to produce the first pound of yield or first bushel, depending upon the crop you're looking at? Corn is about that 9 to 10 inch range. Wheat is about 7, so that's where you see the water tolerance, drought tolerance with the wheat. Proso is down close to that 3.5 inches of water use during the growing season. The cowpeas are closer to that too, what we're seeing. So that's where cowpeas are very favorable. Low water use to see that first pound, but not a great response per inch of water. So that's where we have to look more at the economics and the value of that crop. Corn is a much lower value crop per pound as compared to cowpeas. I was looking at cowpeas at around 50 cents per pound last year. Proso last year's price was about 25 cents per pound. Wheat was closer in that 16, and corn was about 15 cents per pound. I can't look at this bushel because everybody's a little different in how they market it. So pounds is it. So if we look at that yield ET relationship, how much do we get for every inch of ET once we're past that yield threshold? With corn, we're returning about $130 per inch. Wheat is about $60. That's why we don't see generally a lot of irrigated wheat for bulk production. Proso is again in that little under $60, but this is where the cowpeas shine compared to corn. They're closer in that $100 per inch of ET at that 50-cent price. So economically, for every inch, they're not as good as corn, but it takes less water than corn to get that first pound. And they're better than wheat and proso as far as that return. So cowpeas respond well to limited water. Maximum yield is a lower water use in comparison to any other crop we have growing in the Northeast Plains. So water use, it makes it a favorable dryland crop as well. Economics do appear favorable to irrigated, and especially under a limited water situation. There is that potential for that dryland limited crop in Northeast Colorado. But there is also that low soil moisture usage compared to other crops. Wheat, corn, millet can be aggressive water users out of the soil. Cowpeas, what we were finding on dryland, about 2.5 inches of water use out of the soil profile, whereas corn would be probably more in that 8 to 9 inch, maybe 10 inch at harvest if there's the moisture available. So this makes it valuable for going back to winter wheat, fallen cowpeas. And we did do that. We got one good year of data. We need to do more of it. But we appeared that growing cowpeas, the yield of wheat was about 10 bushels less than when we had it under fallow in 2020 to 2021. So there is those. And here's kind of one thing we're trying to look at is yield prediction under an irrigated situation. How many pods per plant do we have? We can see a pretty good relationship here looking at those type of predictions just from a quick count of pods. And this is a little bit finer tuned data using averages. So over a larger area. So there is a potential to try to calculate yield potential. And with that, I'm kind of done, Larry. And up to questions.
Thank you, Joel.
And we'll look at chat. I see six new ones here.
Yeah, and I want to go back a little bit, Courtney, if you're still on, and Dawn. Somebody had asked if anyone knows of cowpea producers on the western slope, and you guys, I don't know of anybody on the western slope.
I don't either.
Okay. Let's see, there's a question about assuming they're successful crop and they start taking roughly the same acres as proso millet, will production outpace the market and processing?
Justin, I'll give you an answer on that quick. The United States imports $19 million of cowpea a year. So it's going to take quite a bit of acres to equal $19 million worth of production. So there is that potential. And then also,
I think the other
as well, getting people to eat cowpeas, black eyes.
Well, and the other beauty of the crop is that, you know, it's more useful than just the grain. The forage is useful. It's useful as animal feed. It's so not all of that production necessarily has to turn into human consumption.
Can I ask, Courtney, is there a limit to the number of contracts that you guys put out each year?
Yes, yes. Each company obviously only has certain storage and processing capacities. So companies will, and seed is also another limiting factor. So all those things work together to determine how much each company is willing to contract on a given year.
Okay.
Hey, Sally, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
We're not currently limiting production on the cowpeas, and there is, a very big export market for cowpeas, and so I don't foresee an issue as far as increasing the production of cowpeas or black-eyed peas.
Okay, thanks, Don. Let's see. Herbicide history. What chemicals do we need to be concerned about? Jason Webb kind of answered this in the chat. You guys can add to it. Mesotrione or Callisto are generally prohibitive. Atrazine to a lesser extent, depending on rainfall that you've had after application. Do you have any others, Courtney or Dawn, to add?
Those are definitely the big ones. Ally, Wide Match, Stinger, those types of products too.
One herbicide that is actually a good one early on that is actually labeled sharpen, as compared to traditional dry beans, which that's a no-no. So we can get by, what is it, a couple of ounces about 30 days ahead of time. Pre-plant, I think up to 2 ounces, maybe 3 ounces on the label.
Yeah, and then we have another question about how they perform at high altitude, 7,000 feet plus. If there's a variety that favors the higher elevation. I'm sure there is. Actually, the San Luis Valley Research Center, the CSU Research Center, grew cowpeas last year under irrigation. They did not get them to flower, so we're wondering if they had enough heat units, or Jason Webb, actually, the guy at the research center there, gave a talk yesterday morning, and Jason Webb brought up a good point of they may have actually over irrigated. So they're going to try cowpeas again there in the San Luis Valley. But I don't currently have any production information or firsthand knowledge of that.
Hey, Sally, the highest elevation that we've done it in would have been in Trinidad, Colorado. I don't know exactly what their elevation is there, but I know it's lower than the 7,000 mark. I think it's going to be a challenge at that elevation to get the crop to maturity, but that's kind of the case with all edible beans. It's kind of it's a little tough at that elevation to try to get them to maturity, depending on the year.
Okay.
So Darren, are you seeing that yield prediction pod count? Darren was asking about that.
Yeah.
The second last one. Can you see that slide?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
And I just want to mention Debbie Hyde brought up that they grazed cattle on a failed dryland black-eyed pea crop, and it worked really well, but they had to watch out for weed nitrate levels. So thank you, Debbie, for sharing that.
Which is interesting, because the first year we grew cowpea at Akron, we have mule deer. They walked through those plots to the pintos, decimated the pintos, and then walked into the corn and never touched the cowpea.
They just didn't know any better.
Well, or the cows are less finicky than deer.
Let's see, there's a question about Indian origin varieties that may help. There are tons of different accessions in different gene bank collections. So there probably is. I don't know offhand. That's something that I could try and look up for you. So let me write myself a note. Michelle, would you direct message me your email so I can get back to you? Let's see, Brian shared they tried it at Riverton, Wyoming at 5,000 feet and it froze in 2020. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, if you guys have firsthand experience, please feel free to share it with everybody.
Do you know which type it was or what variety it was on that freeze at Riverton? That would be helpful. I can't see my chat now.
Type 50, he said. And then before people start hopping off here, I want to launch, we have a quick poll, multiple choice poll that we just put together to get some more information on if you guys are current producers or just interested in the crop and what other types of webinars you might be interested in the future. So I'm going to launch that right now. And if you could respond to that before you hop off, that would be awesome. Did that pop up for everybody? Okay, cool.
So
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you everybody for hopping on today. I hope the information was useful. As you can probably tell, we're still learning a lot about the crop. I've been working with it for only 2 or 3 years now, but I'm very excited about the production potential for Eastern Colorado. And we'll continue doing research on it. Joel, I know, and actually Joel and I were just trying to get some more grant funding to continue this research in 2023. So
I'd just like to give a big shout out to Sally and Joel for all the research that you guys have done on them, that you guys have definitely taken out an enormous amount of question marks with the crop to really feel really comfortable with the crop to this point, and look forward to the future research you guys do. You guys are a huge help. So thanks for putting this on.
well,
Yeah,
we still have a lot
Yes.
of questions in our own heads.
yeah. Yeah, Joel and I have endless research ideas.
Well, one thing to ask, then I'll let you talk, Courtney. I heard you. We do have a project looking at cowpea in a rotation. And if anybody knows Akron, the research station there, the alternative crop rotation study, which is a long-term rotation. Cody or Dave, how long has that been going? 1990 or 89 is when they first started that. Did they leave? Must have.
No, Cody's still on.
I believe it was 90.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So we started a rotation a week. So we're looking at wheat, corn, cowpea rotation compared to a wheat, corn, millet rotation compared to the traditional wheat, corn, fallow rotation. So we're intensifying that rotation in there. And Jessica is the leader of that grant. If she, I don't know if she's left or not.
She had to leave.
Oh, she had to leave. Okay. So she's the leader of that. So we're looking at pulse crops in a rotation, primarily dry land for the eastern slope, but we are looking at it, not cowpea, but other pulses on the west slope as well. So there you go, Courtney. I'll shut up.
Oh, no, thank you both for doing this today. And I appreciate the work you've done on the black eyes. And I think it's a really promising crop for the area and the situations that we face and climate and rotation and everything. So
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for participating, Courtney and Dawn. I think it's really useful to have your perspective from the industry standpoint. Yeah, and this webinar was recorded. I forgot to hit record during my talk, as is tradition. But yes, I will put the rest of the webinar up on YouTube, on the CSU Extension YouTube channel here probably in a week or so. We'll get that posted. And so you could find that then. I'll also put the YouTube video on our website, csucrops.com, on the dry bean and cowpea page. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. If you have any follow-up questions for us, send us an email or direct message. We'll stay on here a few minutes if you want to unmute.